Eric's.
Omar.
Trex, we gotta talk about something, man.
Okay, I'm all ears.
They're coming for us. I wanna now you're in my in group. Just because we've spoken about Trextopia, right? Okay, and the Trex army. But what
and Trex Nation.
Yes, and Trex Nation. What you're not aware of,
Trex
however,
Hive.
the Hive, is Helm's Deep. And it's his people that roll out for him, only because, of course, like we would do episodes and I really want to listen to Helms. Completely understandable, right? Like Omar, those jokes. I don't even know what you're referencing, man. Tarkovsky, that sounds weird. Just stop talking, please. I understand that. However, we had a trio episode where actually we were doing a deep dive into Trex lore, right? What you've gone through, kind of your exercise, the wrestling background, personal favorite, top 10 of this year. And people, so let me set this up because our audience, it's a diverse audience. There's tons of great feedback. So I'm going to read a few things, Trex, and then I'm going to need some commentary about something. Okay. So, Helms, you could react to this one. Someone said, Omar repeatedly insisting that Helms is a LARPer till Helms just gives up on correcting him and accepts the label is a hidden plot line in this podcast. And guys, I think, Omar's beginning to wear down the resistance. My siege warfare uses a term for it, but is beginning to wear down the resistance.
I mean, yeah, you basically have. I think I've explained many times that in the outcast society of people who really love role-playing games, there's a hierarchy, right? The people who are generally accepted by society and are some just, generally just people who don't even know that this hierarchy exists, they play role-playing games in a video game format. Slight step down, massive multiplayer online role-playing game, a little nerdier. Then you have the first level of outcast, but not the bottom, tabletop role-playing gamers who roll dice, maybe use digital dice if they're savvy like myself, or just, don't want to remember where your dice are, or don't want to have a big bag of dice. And then you have the people who we look down on because there's nobody else and we need to feel good about ourselves. We have the live action role players who will throw a Nerf ball at each other when they cast Fireball, while we're like, I use a pewter figurine and I'm on a hex map, and sometimes I will use an online interface from D&D Beyond or Roll20, but in person, going out in the woods, actually being out in nature, loser. But no, you've worn me down. I'm fine. Whatever, I'm a LARPer. It doesn't matter.
So, Trex, that's like a funny comment, right?
Sure.
We're cruising. Okay. Then another one, Santiago said, you guys cater to me. Been watching all the Barbell Medicine Pain podcast lectures and Omar's Roundtable featuring Trex from a chunk of years ago and left wondering about lingering pains. And also yesterday, I stupidly arm wrestled a student without warming up and now got elbow pain, hoping not to pull an Omar and clears up soon, meaning I now have this elbow issue. You guys are heroes. The whole evidence-based community, truly thank you guys. That's Trex. I want a reaction on that. That's a positive just comment from one of our listeners.
It's fantastic. I think, Omar, we all would agree that Pain Roundtable is the best piece of content any of us has been associated with. And I do have more to say about pain and injury, but I'm saving that for a later date.
I think if anyone ever asks me to define what pain is, I'm just going to say I'm going to say, I want to introduce a physics concept, entropy, in a system. For me.
I don't know if I've ever come clean on the air, but the alleged technical difficulties I suffered during that were just an act of protest. I just said, I'm leaving. I'll be back in an hour.
I felt so abandoned because myself and Trex, we have such good energy where I said, Trex, with your credentials, I just want to make sure that this roundtable stays focused. Anyways, this is part of that. Let's call it the extended Helms Iron Culture lore, because it was like a proto Iron Culture where I had Trex on my channel doing some moderation. Anyways, and then someone gave a reference.
When the moderator bounces on a roundtable, things have gone badly.
Yeah, I felt abandoned. So, and then Yuppie, who leaves typically a fair number of comments, said, "Shadows to I have no mouth and I must scream," which is a great fictional piece of work. And then he actually referenced some of the original Fallouts, and we spoke, Trex, anyways, this video game, myself and Helms, about Fallout not going to deviate from what I want to read. Everything sounds so good. And then someone leaves this comment, Trex, having to suffer through Trexler and Omar just to get a Helms is excruciating. So the thing is, Trex, I'm fine. They mention mine. I get it. You don't want to listen to me? Totally fine. But folks, like, Trexler is a pillar of the community. Everything that he says related to exercise science, but just in general, his quips, they're very funny. I can't, like, this Helms, this is his transgression right here. Trex, your reaction.
Which episode was this on?
You sharing about your life journey, man, about your lifting, the pain. It's like what to do. Like, literally the episode about you. This person, I guess, did not enjoy it.
Maybe they are the big brain fitness people who've decided that pain actually technically doesn't exist, and that if you just decide not to have pain, you won't. So they were probably just like, oh, this again. Yeah, another person who's noceboed themselves into feeling that they have an injury. So that's probably what happened. So I'm not going to take that personally.
Helms.
You shouldn't. You know, I'm looking at the comment right now, and it says not Helms' alt account, and how dare that person? You know, how dare they? You know, because it's not like they jumped on an episode where Trex was talking science. They specifically chose the episode where we learned about Trex as a person and pointed out that was what they had an issue with. So, yeah, we're gonna have to definitely, ban that account. So, yeah.
I will just say, I want to dedicate this episode to that individual because this is a Trex featured episode where he's going to be talking all about saturated fat. I got it. See, like Helms, like, okay, I make some esoteric references. I go on a tangent. I understand, but I'm like, Trex, it's been not quite a year yet, but we've had so many powerful episodes, and I like how Trex sticks to the script. The only time when I was absent and you guys had Coach Kassim, and Trex then, because you, Helms, and like you were having like a very productive conversation, and then, Trex would just hop in a little bit, say like a little bit of a joke. I'm like, I see what he's doing. Come on, man. So this is dedicated to that person. Trex, we're boosting you again, man. I understand that you have this cover story, something like a mass, something associated with mass, something going on here.
That is correct. And I want to appreciate you for appreciating me for being what we call in the baseball world a utility player. You want to put me in right field, you want to put me in the hot corner over at third base, hell, I'll get up on the mound and toss the pill around. I will do what Iron Culture needs. And today, what Iron Culture needs is a good old-fashioned discussion about saturated fat. So I want to begin with a question, Omar. Do you eat fat?
That's a leading question. I'm going to say yes, but by the end of this, I might consume zero fat.
Well, we will see. This episode, we're going to be talking a little bit about fat in general, but specifically about the different types of fat. Saturated, unsaturated is really going to be our main delineation. So, you've probably seen that on the back of a food label. I don't know how they do food labeling in Canada country or wherever the heck Helms lives. I don't even know if they have food labels, but in America, we've got your total fat and your saturated fat listed clearly. Now, the difference there, taking you back to the old biochemistry classes from high school and college, it all comes down to this hydrocarbon chain for these fatty acids, right? So when you look at the structure of a fat, the molecular structure, there's this long hydrocarbon chain. It can be short, medium, or long for different types of fatty acids. And if that hydrocarbon chain has all single bonds from carbon to carbon, that's a saturated fat. If there is one double bond, it's monounsaturated. And if there are two or more double bonds, that is a polyunsaturated fat. So sometimes it seems so kind of ill-defined when you just see it as this thing on the back of a food label, but it really just comes down to the actual structure of that chain. That's how we identify these different types of fat. And I think people in the fitness world are generally, certainly have become quite comfortable with the idea that different fats do different things, both when it comes to whenever you're teaching anatomy or you're teaching nutrition, there's always this talk in a broad sense about a linkage between structure and function, right? And that's certainly the case with dietary fat. When we talk about dietary fats or different fatty acids that have different chain lengths or different numbers of double bonds or different placement of double bonds, we talk about how they might impact the body a little bit differently, right? So some of the classic examples, people basically universally agree that artificial trans fats, fully or partially hydrogenated oils, they just suck. They're not good. Back in the day, when we didn't know as much about them, we thought maybe they were a wonderful idea, right? We can take an unsaturated fat, we can hydrogenate this oil and basically have it take on characteristics that are more like a saturated fat. It was really good for improving shelf stability of packaged foods. And at the time, that was a serious innovation. But man, the linkage between trans fat and dyslipidemia and heart disease risk, people were like, okay, my bad. We basically rolled that back. So trans fats, and we don't really need to get into the whole cis trans fat, how those bonds actually look at the molecular level. But again, the trans fat is named that way because of the orientation of the double bonds, and basically, the orientation of that hydrocarbon chain. They're not good, right? Saturated fat, again, all single bonds. People are generally at least aware of the idea that, hey, it seems like those ones seem to maybe impact blood lipids a little differently than unsaturated fats. And then even among unsaturated fats, probably the most pertinent example of that structure-function relationship comes back to good old-fashioned fish oil. Who doesn't love popping a good 4 to 6 giant capsules of fish oil, right? And fish oil, you've got EPA and DHA. Those are two specific marine-derived omega-3 polyunsaturated fatty acids, meaning they have multiple double bonds in their long hydrocarbon chain, both EPA and DHA do. And the first, you could go from one end to the other, however you want to put it. But if we say the omega end is the kind of end of that chain, 3 positions from there, that's where that final double bond is located. So omega-3 fatty acid, right? And people take fish oil because they inherently have come to believe from science, marketing, et cetera, and it's very, very true that these omega-3 fatty acids have unique roles in the body because of their structure. Okay, so that's like the quick little crash course about why these different types of fat matter. They have different structures, and those structures can ultimately impact how these fats function in the body. Now, in previous mass content, I've talked a little bit about how much fat a person might need as a bare minimum. Because Omar, fitness folks are different. Lovely people. Some of my best friends are fitness people, okay? But they're a different breed. So for most people, when we talk about in the general population guidelines for fat, you're wondering, what's the most amount I can have before I suffer adverse consequences, right? So people think about dyslipidemia, heart disease, etc. But fitness people, in many cases, actually ask the opposite. Do I actually need this stuff? How low can I go if I really just want to do the old rice and the driest chicken breast I could possibly have every day? Do I really need, fat in the diet? So probably about a year ago, I don't know, I've totally lost track of time. I wake up, I do what I'm supposed to do, I go to bed, I repeat. But I wrote an article about minimum fat intake heuristics. And what's really fascinating is if you try to make an evidence-based article about that, as I found, it's actually not so easy because researchers haven't looked into it with a high level of detail. And I understand why. You have to go pretty far out of your way to craft a diet that has perilously low fat. And frankly, from a public health consideration, no one's dealing with it, right? I mean, especially when you get to fairly affluent countries with industrialized economies and industrialized food systems, you're not finding people who need to go out of their way to get their 12th gram of fat for the day. If anything, you've got people who are going way overboard and trying to figure out how do we kind of reformulate foods to move them to a lower fat state. But anyway, I looked at these different reasons you would need fat in the diet and how much fat you would need in order to kind of have enough based on that particular consideration. So the first thing, Omar, have you ever had a gallstone?
Fortunately not.
Helms, any gallstones for you?
Nope.
So me either. So 3 of us are fortunate, not something I want to experiment with. But apparently one of the few fairly reliable adverse effects that is observed in pretty intensive weight loss clinical trials is the formation of gallstones. And it seems like gallstones tend to form on really extreme, rapid weight loss diets that involve extremely low fat intakes. So these are the types of studies where the researchers will formulate a nutrition beverage and say, here's all your calories for the day in this bottle, have fun with it. And people will be on these like 600, 700, 800 calorie diets. And these are folks who may be burning in excess of 3,000 calories a day based on their body size. So they are losing fat and losing weight extremely rapidly. And their fat intake in some of these early studies was literally like 1 gram a day, 3 grams a day. Now that seemed to be causing fairly reliably some degree of gallstone formation in at least a percentage of the sample. So it looks like based on the research available, if you want to attenuate that, you probably want to go for at least 7 to 12 grams per day of fat. If you're eating foods and you're not going out of your way to only select fat-free foods, you're probably hitting 7 or 12 grams a day without thinking about it. So that's intellectually fascinating. It's pertinent to supplement-only diets, but for most people, probably not something they have to actually think about. Now, other reasons we need fat in the diet. One is to make sure that we're taking in essential fatty acids. So we talked a little bit about fat structure and function. What's really interesting is that different organisms can kind of rearrange different hydrocarbon chains in a differential manner. So what I mean by that is different organisms have different enzymatic machinery in terms of turning an omega-6 fatty acid into an omega-9 fatty acid, or turning this saturated fatty acid into a different saturated fatty acid. We kind of need to move these things around to make sure that we're building our body the way we need it and using fats the way we need to, especially when it comes to the composition of all of our cell membranes, which are made out of fat. There's this phospholipid bilayer. So we need to have some interchangeability of these different fatty acid chains. We need to be able to chop them up and rearrange them. And what's really interesting about the human body is that we lack the enzymes necessary to kind of create our own omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids out of other fatty acids. We can interchange and kind of rearrange a lot of different types of fatty acids, but omega-3 and omega-6 we cannot build out of other things. We need to get those from our diet, and that's why they're called essential fatty acids. Now, the reason people talk about omega-3 so much is because in the typical Western diet and other highly processed diets in affluent countries and industrialized economies, omega-6 fatty acids are everywhere. You may have consumed some questionable seed oil content that has reminded you that omega-6 fatty acids are everywhere. They were probably telling you to hide under your desk to be afraid of those omega-6s that are everywhere. But we really typically don't need to go too far out of our way to get enough omega-6, but omega-3, sometimes we do. And if you want to make sure that you're supporting essential fatty acid intake, which would include both omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids, obviously the exact amount of fat is going to depend on which fat sources you utilize. But my best estimate is that for most fairly non-extreme diets that use a diverse mixture of fat sources, probably 20 or 30 grams a day, in most cases, should be plenty. Which is convenient because that's probably also how much you need to absorb fat-soluble vitamins effectively. And yes, helps.
Would you say that if you are trying to get the full complement of EFAs in a reasonable dose, but you're only consuming 20 to 30 grams, that you actually have to be pretty intentional with your fat sources on a diet like that?
Yeah, I would. And it's tricky because even the estimates for how much essential fatty acids you need aren't really
clear.
They're not very clear. I've seen a variety of different estimates about how much you need of each one. So that 20 to 30 minimum is a really rough estimate. And like you said, a very important clarification is that it does assume that you basically have decided, I'm doing a super low fat diet, hopefully for a fixed period of time, not forever. So you're going to do this 2 or 3 month low-fat diet where you're really grinding out the last few pounds of a weight loss diet. And that 20 to 30 grams assumes that you're being quite intentional about making sure that whatever fat sources you're utilizing, they are either high in omega-3 or omega-6 fat or both, to try to make sure you're squeezing everything you can out of those limited 20 to 30 grams a day. It's an important clarification, because by no means can I say, oh, I had 20 grams of fat today, I'm sure I got plenty of omega-3, omega-6. That's absolutely not the case. This is the bare minimum if you're being intentional to even basically give you a shot of getting there with reasonably enriched or reasonably concentrated food sources that have omega-3 and omega-6 present. So 20 or 30 grams should be enough for that. And it should also be enough for facilitating the absorption of fat-soluble vitamins. Fat-soluble vitamins are really interesting because you do want to have some fat kind of in the GI system when you are actually ingesting, digesting, absorbing those vitamins themselves. So eating with fat really helps with that. And, this is like the classic, if you take a basic nutrition class, they say, hey, you're eating that salad with a bunch of vitamin A and vitamin E. Why don't you put a little, a dressing with a little bit of fat on there? And it's funny, like, as much as I know it's not true, every time I've taken a nutrition course at a university, there's always this like super healthy dietitian who teaches the class. And they're like, look at this beautiful salad just drizzled with a hint of olive oil. And I'm like, you're making this sound appealing and I'm buying it, but I know that salad tastes terrible because it's just like the plainest salad with just like a little drop of oil on it. I know that doesn't taste good, but you're selling me on it. I don't know what it is. But
pause.
Yeah.
Hold on, because I have to say I'm a salad guy. You don't like any type of salad. I understand it's
no,
a lot of greens.
No.
Okay.
He's just saying olive oil alone is not a dressing.
Olive oil is not a dressing.
Yes.
Yeah, so they're
gotta
basically
get some balsamic and maybe some garlic.
Red pepper flakes,
we're good.
kale salad.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're on the salad train. Okay,
yeah,
not that shit salad.
I love a good salad. I love a good salad, but no, that's the specific part where they'll act like there are normal people out there, and I know that's a very aggressive way to frame it, but they're acting like there's normal people out there who are drizzling just pure olive oil on this salad with all this purple and orange and yellow and red stuff in it. And I'm like, I've seen what salads look like, and it's not that. So nice try, folks. But anyway, 20 or 30 grams should be good for that. And of course, we've talked about this previously ad nauseum. This isn't a secret anymore in fitness. If you want to support sex hormone production, you got to eat enough fat. And I would say bare minimum, you want to get a good 40, 60 grams a day to give yourself a shot at that. Now, you can find studies that say, hey, you might even want as high as 35, 40% of your calories coming from fat if you want to absolutely maximize sex hormone production. But I think there's some confounding factors that lead into that particular estimate. I think it really comes to, I think specifically when you're on fairly calorie restricted diets, you may need the percentage to be that high. But if you're eating, plenty of total energy, I doubt that you really have a meaningful reduction in testosterone. If, for example, you drop from 40% of calories from fat down to like 25 or 30. Drop into 20, it depends. It really depends on total calorie intake. So anyway,
there's also data showing that estrogen production can actually be lower in women when they're restricting fat as well. So,
completely parallel lines of research where even the numbers actually end up lining up pretty well. Yeah, so it's kind of an analogous thing with fat intake affecting testosterone in males and affecting estrogen in females for sure. So that's where we've been with previous mass content on fat. But my latest article is a cover story, which, Omar, you don't really know the internal politics of the Mass Research Review. But these discussions about who has been selected for the cover story, they get heated, they get personal. I actually am not on speaking terms with anyone else on the Mass team right now, aside from when we're recording content because of how some of this stuff has gone. But I was selected through a very contentious process. And the article is called From the Mailbag, Is Saturated Fat Inherently Fattening? Because there is I think a relatively pervasive belief, and we'll talk about whether it's true or not, but I think there's a belief that saturated fat, aside from its effects on blood lipids or its perceived effects on blood lipids, I think there is a common belief that something about saturated fat is actually inherently fattening, in the sense that if I eat 20 grams of saturated fat, it will impact my body composition in a slightly different way than if I ate 20 grams of monounsaturated fat or polyunsaturated fat, or a combination of the two. And so in my article, I try to look at that from a lot of different angles. So I start out by considering, where does this belief come from? And then I talk about mechanisms that may underlie such an effect if it exists. Then I look at more kind of outcome-focused empirical data on whether or not this is a true thing. And then I, of course, layer it with caveats and try to look at it from other perspectives and say, okay, I will, give away the goods here. It's not actually all that true, but I look at some angles about how it may seem true, or how there might be at least a little bit of a grain of truth to it. Okay. So first of all, where does this come from? I think that's probably an intuitive place to begin the discussion. And I think there's a few things that have kind of given rise to this idea. And one of those things is probably just vibes. So like, I think there's a cluster of observations that people make simultaneously. And whenever we make simultaneous observations in a cluster, we tend to, in our minds, link those observations, whether or not they are causally linked to one another. And so what I mean by that is, we might look at someone who consumes a lot of what we might colloquially call junk food, and they eat a lot of that, and it tends to have a lot of saturated fat, and perhaps they have developed a high level of adiposity after years of that type of dietary pattern. And perhaps they also have dyslipidemia, or, blood lipids outside of the preferred range based on their intake of saturated fat. So I think people have, and then of course, played out over long enough time, perhaps that progresses into a diagnosis of heart disease, right? So in people's minds, they're seeing, okay, junk food, saturated fat, dyslipidemia, heart disease, obesity, lumping it all together and thinking there's something about these saturated fat foods that is clearly kind of giving rise to a lot of these different things, not just dyslipidemia, not just heart disease, but also the obesity itself, the excess adiposity. So I think that's one thing that probably feeds into it. Another thing that feeds into it, though, to be totally candid, there was a study back in 2014 where they did an overfeeding study, very well controlled, using muffins. And basically, they had these two different muffin groups. One group was eating muffins, overfeeding with muffins that were made with a high content of saturated fat. The other group was getting the exact same muffins, the same overfeeding protocol, but instead of having a high saturated fat content, it had a high polyunsaturated fat content. So in terms of texture, taste, flavor, they should have been approximately equal, really well-designed study. And what they found was both groups gained similar amounts of weight during the 7-week overfeeding period. But the group that had the saturated fat muffins, they gained comparatively more fat mass and less lean mass or fat-free mass. So there is like a little tiny granule of evidence from this one study that there's something about saturated fat that when you overfeed with it, or you're bulking up maybe, and you have more saturated fat in the diet, maybe it actually is leading to increased fat storage relative to other types of fat consumed at the same exact calorie total and grams of fat. So it's a really interesting concept, but I think you have to look into how might this happen? What might be some mechanisms that actually explain this, right? Or could explain such a phenomenon. And there have been a couple really good studies that have looked into this. So one of the studies that I review in this recent article was by, I'm going to need help with pronunciation. The last name is spelled Nguo. Does anyone want to venture a guess into how that's pronounced?
Nguo. No, but that's a guess.
Sounds good to me. So they published a study, I believe in 2018, and they were looking at 3 different kinds of fat and seeing how they would impact the thermic effect of feeding and appetite responses hours after a meal. Because you might say, and it has been said by some folks, saturated fat is inherently fattening because there's a lower thermic effect of feeding. We can digest, absorb, metabolize it while burning fewer calories in the process compared to other fats. That's a theory. Another theory or a hypothesis is that saturated fat has a lesser impact on satiety, or future appetite responses in the hours following a meal, such that when you're eating saturated fat instead of unsaturated fat, you may be more inclined to overeat at that meal and in subsequent meals due to the differences in appetite regulation. So in this study, they had a really fantastic approach to it. They gave meals that should have really exaggerated this impact in a controlled setting. So these were very high fat, isoenergetic meals. And they did 3 different meals because they were looking at monounsaturated fat, they were looking at long chain saturated fat, and they were also looking at short/medium chain saturated fat sources. So for the monounsaturated fat, they're looking at avocado, olive oil, and olives as the primary sources. Beautiful Mediterranean spread they've got here, right? Avocado, does that fit in with the Mediterranean diet? I don't know. I think I get mine from California. But
it's a bonus from
olives, olive oil, Anyway, the long chain saturated fatty acid, that was from beef and palm fat sources. And then the short and medium chain saturated fatty acids, those were from cream, coconut cream, cream cheese, so dairy and coconut sources primarily. So they gave these high-fat meals. They looked at these post-meal responses, and the short version of the results is that all 3 of these meals, despite their very different fat composition with similar total fat content, they ended up yielding similar effects on the thermic effect of feeding. So the acute rise in energy expenditure that we see after a meal is ingested, it was similar for all 3 meals. And then looking at hunger and fullness ratings after all 3 test meals, they didn't really find any differences there. Everything looked quite similar. So it's really fascinating because you've got this 2014 study by Roskvist and colleagues that seemed to indicate that maybe saturated fat was inherently fattening, at least in the context of overfeeding. But when we look at this study by Ngo and colleagues, none of the mechanisms that you might expect to be at play were really observed in this really highly controlled setting. So I think with that in mind, it's worth revisiting that 2014 study and looking at it in a little more detail. So like I said, there's 2 different muffin groups. One is getting muffins with palm oil, which is a saturated fat. The other is getting muffins with sunflower oil, which is a polyunsaturated fat. It was a 7-week overfeeding study with 39 adult participants. And what they found was that both groups gained about 1.6 kilograms of total weight. Now, that's not a lot of total weight in general. Now, if you were weight stable and 7 weeks later you would gain 1.6 kilograms, you would say, hey, that's something. That's weird. But when we're trying to look at differences in the composition of weight gained, you're going to be looking at small magnitudes. So, for example, they were looking at volume of mass gain since they were looking at MRI, but they found that the difference in fat gain was like 1.5 versus 0.97 liters of volume. And then looking at the lean tissue, we're looking at 0.86 versus 0.31. So you're looking at these really, really small differences. And so Roskvist and colleagues actually sought to replicate their own study. And this actually came out this year. So a full decade later, they said, okay, let's go in and make sure that we really feel good that this is a reliable, reproducible finding. And it's important to recognize that's not them saying, hey, let's go and reverse the fraud we did. It's not them saying, let's go unbotch the study that we botched. It is not just normal, but actually expected that when we do small studies, even if we do them well, we will see variation in the results from just random chance, from gathering different samples, from using different measurement techniques. We should expect in a body of literature that we don't get literally the exact same effect every single time. And if you really wanted to figure out what we found the first time, is that a robust, reliable, valid estimate of the true effect, you would make a couple changes. And that's what they did. Instead of a 7-week overfeeding period, they turned it up a little bit to 8 weeks. And of course, these studies are hard to do for very, very long durations. So they went a little bit longer with it. They recruited 61 individuals instead of 39. And they also kind of did a separate analysis using data from almost 14,000 people in the UK Biobank data repository, which is basically the UK version of NHANES. So they were looking at a bigger, longer study in their lab, really tightly controlled. And then they were also cross-referencing their findings with this observational data, which is really high-quality data that the UK is collecting in the biobank study. Now, just like the prior study, they did find that both groups gained similar amounts of total body mass. However, this time around, they did not observe statistically or practically relevant or significant changes or differences, I should say, in the composition of tissue that was gained. So they both gained a little bit of weight, just like last time, but this time around, there was no differential impact on how much weight was gained as fat rather than lean mass if you were overfeeding with saturated fat versus polyunsaturated fat. And then when they cross-referenced that with the data, with the huge data set from the UK Biobank, once again, they really couldn't find any evidence to suggest that overfeeding with polyunsaturated fat was disproportionately increasing lean tissue or attenuating the amount of fat tissue that individuals had when it was compared to saturated fat. So looking at the totality of this data, I think, first of all, it gives us a really fantastic real-world example of why replication is important and why researchers who seek to replicate their own findings are, I wouldn't call them necessarily superheroes, but they're not far from it. It takes a lot of time, effort, resources, and personal sacrifice to say, that thing I just did, I'm going to do it again, but harder. There's not a lot of fanfare for doing the same thing twice with a few more people, right? But it is so critically important. And, another great example of that is you look back at the first study that identified non-celiac gluten intolerance. And man, the impact that had once it kind of hit the mainstream kind of popular dissemination of new science articles, those same researchers tried to replicate their initial finding of non-celiac gluten intolerance or gluten sensitivity, and they were unable to do so. And later on, additional research says, maybe this isn't a gluten thing. Maybe it's more of a FODMAPs thing. Probably a different tangent for a different day, but it's another good example of how you get this first finding, and even if it takes you 10 years to go back to it, it's generally a worthwhile endeavor to go back and make sure, if you can, that the original finding is robust and repeatable and reproducible. So this is a great example of that, and the eventual takeaway is that we really don't see much evidence to suggest that saturated fat is inherently fattening at the whole body level. But, Omar, that doesn't mean that this concept is totally without merit or without justification. You could look at this from a couple different angles and say, actually, it still makes sense to at least pay attention to how much saturated fat you're consuming versus unsaturated fat. One olive branch I want to extend out to folks who believe saturated fat is inherently fattening. an olive branch that I'd like to extend is acknowledging the fact that saturated fat could promote excess adiposity or fat gain without causing excess adiposity or fat gain. And I'm using cause in a very literal way there. Okay. So I do not dispute the idea that if someone started to eat more foods with plenty of saturated fat, I don't dispute anecdotes that doing that may cause some individuals to gain weight or may promote weight gain in some individuals. But what I try to get across in my article is that this is not because, or it doesn't appear to be because of some inherent characteristic of saturated fat per se. It's not like there's something about its structure where we look at it and say, that thing is making you gain a bunch of fat mass. However, if we look at the actual food changes they're making when they switch from a low saturated fat diet to a higher saturated fat diet, they might be, in getting a beef entree instead of a chicken-based entree, which does have more saturated fat, but it just has more calories in general. And a lot of people will tend to find that a beef entree may even be more palatable than your typical like grilled chicken entree. So perhaps you also have a larger portion in addition to higher calorie content per ounce of meat. Same thing, you might find that instead of eating oatmeal at breakfast, you're getting a donut or a bagel with cream cheese. So you're still just having like this one thing for breakfast, but you are probably expanding the calorie content of these individual meal swaps. So I definitely don't dispute that folks who they say, no, anecdotally, I'm certain that I gain weight when I eat more saturated fat. You very well may, but it might be because you're eating foods that have higher energy density, have higher calories. They're more palatable, so you tend to eat larger portions of them. But it doesn't seem to be some weird physiological quirk related to the molecular structure of saturated fat or some biochemistry of its metabolism that is actually making saturated fat inherently fattening. What's up, Helms?
Yeah, I think this is actually just a great teaching point around a real world example of ecological validity, right? So for us to study in a valid way in the lab, these comparisons head to head in controlled conditions of fat, we have to do things that are quite artificial, like making muffins with fats we wouldn't normally expect, or creating these strange meals that they wouldn't be comparable in an outside setting. Like if you said, hey, let's compare some olives, avocado to some beef, you'd be like, those are not a swap. Those are not things. And while we do eat nutrients, we don't seek out nutrients. We eat foods which contain nutrients. And this is sometimes where you get the disconnect between the more strict if it fits your macros crowd and what really is the best ideal approach to eating in the real world, because we are like, it's true to say on a macronutrient by macronutrient basis, protein might be more satiating than say carbs or fats. But in reality, you can eat a whole bowl of fibrous carbohydrates, and if you ate like the same amount of grams of protein from protein, or if you ate the same amount of calories from protein, it's not the same thing as just comparing the macros. So yeah, I think this is just another great example of that, where when we create a internally consistent laboratory controlled condition, that's not necessarily the same thing as what type of ecologically valid in the real world, the trenches as we call them, what is really going to be compared. And I think this is a perfect example of that, and where you get a disconnect between public health messaging and kind of our more nerdy, physiological, fitness-based, bodybuilding-focused thinking. And I think there are issues with both, and it's important to understand them. But yeah, great summary. Keep going.
Yeah, no, and I mean, you could take it even further. People often say we don't eat macros, we eat foods. But you could take it a step further and say we don't eat foods, we eat meals. And and that's, I think, important when we talk about, for example, a breakfast swap. It's not that you're going to say, well, instead of oatmeal, I'm going to have a grilled chicken salad for breakfast. Like, probably not, right? You're going to be choosing from wherever you live in the world, or whatever type of dietary pattern you find yourself following. you're probably going to have a set list of like, these are breakfast meal arrangements, right? It's not like you walk up to a breakfast buffet at a conference when they have some food out and say, I have no idea what I'm finding on this table. It could be anything. Is it lobster? Is it spaghetti? It's like, no, it's going to be, you got your bagels over there, maybe a few muffins. You know the spread, right? Based on kind of the cultural tie of wherever you happen to be. So, yeah, when you think about swaps, you have to think about not just, protein instead of fat or this fat instead of the other, but, life isn't like you're going to walk up to that breakfast buffet and say, do you want the sunflower oil muffin or would you prefer the palm oil muffin, right? What are you talking about? It doesn't make any sense. So that's a really good point. So one olive branch is like, anecdotally, you may indeed find that you tend to gain weight when you eat more saturated fats because of the food choices that go along with that. You may also find the opposite to be true, depending on what type of food selections you gravitate toward. Another olive branch I wanted to acknowledge is there is one specific instance where saturated fat is inherently fattening at the tissue-specific level, but not necessarily at the whole body level. So, a lot of folks are aware that when you overfeed really aggressively with sugar, and specifically with fructose, it has an effect on your liver where you are more likely to gain a disproportionate amount of liver fat. Like I said, added sugar and especially high fructose content really seems to deposit some extra fat in the liver. And that's really important because when your liver starts to accumulate more fat, and it's not like you're going to accumulate kilograms and kilograms of fat. We're talking about, at the gram level, not a single gram, but, a certain number of grams of extra fat accumulation there can start to actually impact things like your blood lipid profile, your glycemic control, right? So if your liver is starting to accumulate fat because you've been over consuming calories and on top of that, eating probably more added sugar than you ought to, and being pretty sedentary, this combination of things may start to show up when you go for your annual physical and they say, it looks like we actually might be kind of drifting near pre-diabetic range based on your glycemic numbers. And it looks like maybe your triglycerides are pretty high right now, and maybe certain cholesterol elements are a little out of whack. So that is true for sugar and specifically fructose, but it also does appear to be true for saturated fat. It does seem that due to some modest differences in the way it's metabolized, overfeeding with saturated fat in the context, like I said, of overnutrition more broadly, just a caloric surplus plus low activity, that combination of factors does seem like saturated fat is a little bit more prone to depositing liver fat or fat in your liver compared to unsaturated fats, and specifically compared to polyunsaturated fat. So there is, at the tissue level, at least some justification that saturated fat could be inherently fattening, but we're talking about, to the magnitude of grams in the liver, not to the magnitude of, oh, great, now I don't have a six-pack when I go to the beach, right? It's very, very modest. It's imperceptible in terms of visual appearance and total body composition, but it does matter when you start looking at some of those nuances of cardiometabolic health. So there's definitely truth to that. So generally speaking, what that means is we don't want to completely ignore the breakdown of saturated and unsaturated fats in our diet. It still makes sense in terms of overall health and cardiometabolic health to at least pay attention to your distribution of different fats in your diet and your total fat intake. So for example, a common recommendation is to limit your total fat intake to no more than 30% of your total energy. And then a common recommendation, which is a pretty solid and simple heuristic, is to have a third of your fat coming from saturated, a third coming from monounsaturated, and a third coming from polyunsaturated. So each one of those is making up no more than 10% of your total calories. So it's a simple heuristic, but it's also an imperfect heuristic. So that heuristic is basically advice to the general population with a few things in mind. First of all, discouraging the overconsumption of fat, which is a common way that people who are not fitness enthusiasts tend to passively overconsume calories, gain weight, develop obesity, etc. So that's one of the reasons that they say, hey, keep your total fat below 30%. One of the reasons that they say also keep your saturated fat below 10% of total energy is specifically because of links between saturated fat intake and blood lipid outcomes, right? So if we do overconsume saturated fat, especially if you're getting up into like 18, 19, 20% of your calories coming from saturated fat, there is a much higher likelihood that you're going to have high LDL cholesterol, high ApoB, which is kind of a more nuanced, kind of more granular predictor or biomarker of cardiovascular disease risk. So that is definitely true. But once again, I have to layer in a bit of a caveat and acknowledge that not every saturated fat is going to impact blood lipids exactly the same way. So in my article, I quote a review paper by Shramko and colleagues. And all these acids I'm about to mention here they all fall under the saturated fat umbrella. So mysteric and lauric acids increase all cholesterol fractions, so total LDL, HDL, ratio of LDL to HDL, triglycerides, ApoA, ApoB, and it does this to a greater extent than palmitic acid. And palmitic acid increases all those cholesterol fractions to a greater extent than stearic acid. So like I said, when we look at studies that are looking at different types of saturated fat with different characteristics in terms of chain length and things like that, chain length, if you have different specific saturated fatty acids in a food, some of those will have different chain lengths. So the saturated fat that we're getting from cream and dairy sources and coconut sources is not necessarily the same thing that we're getting from beef or the same thing that we're getting from palm oil. So it is true that you could get way more granular and way more detailed and look at the specific saturated fatty acids in your diet and decide that you want to, say I'm going to have more of this and less of that. But I can tell you one thing, Omar and Helms. Government guidelines for the general population will never get so detailed that they're going to be telling you to seek out myristic or lauric acid specifically. It will never, ever, ever get there. So
we kind of have different recommendations for, say, dairy versus red meat, but that's probably
right.
The most granular. Yeah,
exactly. And even that, I think is. I'm kind of confused where we're at with the food pyramid in America because we kind of flipped it into this like it's all vertical panels now, and I don't think they actually have like clear numbers of servings on them. I think they still put out some recommendations that do delineate that with a little more clarity of servings per day, but all of that is to say I haven't really been keeping up with it. I personally am fond of the Healthy Diet Indicator guidelines, and I've written about those in past mass articles. But if you want to look them up, the Healthy Diet Indicator criteria from 2015 and then the revised version from 2020, pretty solid, pretty good advice. They talk about, how much fruit and vegetable you should take in, polyunsaturated fat, free sugar, fiber, potassium, sodium, all that stuff. So I personally like those guidelines. But that does bring me to another point that I wanted to make, which is that these guidelines, building off that give and take of, how much complexity and nuance is really necessary here. Guidelines are just guidelines, right? So it is still a good idea to say, hey, let's keep saturated fat to less than 10% because frankly, I don't want to bother looking at the exact fatty acid profile of every fat source that finds its way into my diet. For me, it's easier to take the basic heuristic and say, okay, less than 10% of energy, I can live with that. That's pretty simple. But I'm certain that some people will push back and say, hey, did you say less than 30% of calories from fat? Because I've got all these public health folks telling me the Mediterranean diet's the best thing you could possibly do. And I look at those interventions and sometimes they're 40% of energy coming from fat. So again, that's where you have to layer in some of the nuance of, yeah, you actually can kind of break that rough guideline of 30% of energy if your fat sources generally are kind of compatible with this Mediterranean eating pattern, right? So there is some complexity. There's a little give and take there. But generally speaking, I still am fairly fond of the idea of simplifying it and saying, okay, if you're going over 30% of your calories from fat, at least, go the extra mile and limit your saturated fat to no more than 10% of your calories. If you want to go a little higher with unsaturated fat, no big deal. That's at least the way that I approach it personally. And then the final thing I want to mention, just as a note of practicality, is I hate recommendations that are framed as percentage of total energy, which may be a surprise because I have to give them a lot because sometimes that's all we've got in the literature. But in this case, I wanted to make sure this article was super practical. And so, if you talk to a bodybuilding audience, I've said this before, but like, I guarantee someone listening to this right now is eating 1,500 calories a day, and I guarantee someone else is eating 5,000 calories a day. And 30% of energy or 10% of energy is just completely different things to them when it comes to saturated fat. So my recommendation is if you want to convert this to just an absolute upper limit of grams per day of saturated fat, again, not because it's going to make you shredded, but in the interest of cardiometabolic health, I'd say maybe that ceiling, that upper limit is in the 22 to 28 grams per day range. So aim it around 25 if you want to average that out, just flat grams per day. Now, if you're way smaller, way larger than the average person and you'd prefer to scale it to body mass, in that case, I'd say probably 0.3 to 0.4 grams per kilogram per day of saturated fat, again, as a ceiling, not as a target. And I think if you stay within those heuristics, if you have a very different body size or a very different caloric intake relative to the population average, I think those heuristics will probably lead you in generally the right direction. So saturated fat, there are good reasons to keep an eye on it and keep it within a certain range. It's not true to say that 0 is way better than 4% of your calories from saturated fat. I certainly don't want to demonize saturated fat. There's no reason to limit with that level of intensity and aggression and severity. But it is a good idea to keep an eye on it, make sure it doesn't creep up too high in the diet purely for reasons related to cardiometabolic health.
Love it. Those are really good recommendations, and I would just add two small things, nice resources for those interested. I kind of like the Eat Well guide. That's the UK's government guidelines. One of the reasons I like it is it gives kind of like this proportionate breakdown. It's not a plate, but it does show kind of things that are and how they break down and how to look at it. And it's much more focused on what you should eat versus what you shouldn't eat. And then another thing is if y'all want to really dig into this article, it is available for free. And Kai in the show notes will have the link over at massresearchreview.com. You can read the whole shebang and dig into all the other references if you really want to nerd out. But yeah, I think that was a great summary, Trex.
I appreciate it. And quick fact check, the pyramid, the new version that's all vertical and stuff with a person climbing up it on a staircase, it actually does have recommendations in terms of cups per day, and it does separate milk from meat and beans and from oils. So that is true. And then I totally forgot about the My Plate thing, which I think exists adjacent or in parallel with the pyramid. I'm not totally clear on the structure of that, but the plate definitely has different portions for different types of dairy versus meat and all that stuff. So props to the government. Don't come after me, government. I'm a good citizen. I'm doing everything I'm supposed to do. What do you want from me?
He pays his taxes. Don't worry, Trex. As soon as I heard pyramid, my first thought was we need to contact our very real Delaware lawyers. Because how dare they use that just as
Why do you think Helms fled America? Because he starts using the pyramid thing and they don't like that around here. So all of a sudden he's afraid to come back.
No. Why do you think they changed to this ambiguous plate/half staircase thing? And that's because our legal team is legit. So
he took on the Department of Justice and
took them down. The DOJ, done. Trex, done.
Get it.
Yeah.
Get it.
Yeah, and so Helms is actually he's kind of our rogue agent, right? So by not being in America, he can make these very difficult choices that are outside of being, him implicated in anything. It's relatively complicated, but Delaware gets it done. It's all we have to say. When we do our very real Treks, agriculture tour, that's also co-promoted by, and we have to inform you about this, our Masculinity in Crisis tour that we are reviving. The whole thing, myself and Helms found that men just they're not as hard as they used to be, just as individuals, and we seek to rectify that. But nonetheless, Delaware gets it done, and I'm sorry to hear that there's still internal politics in the hallowed halls of Mass, which everyone should be subscribed to. Treks, monthly application, String Sports. Kai will have the link in the description. I assume, and I didn't want to bring this until the end. I know we're about to do an hour of power. I thought that was a fantastic review. That it may have been Helms as the emerging social media star, right? Being featured on big channels, growing his following. Like, I could only assume that one Dr. Mike Zordos was contractually obligated with the new contract that Helms gave him to create a social media account. Like, hey, we need to be present and present when it comes to, informing the masses. And that Helms is like, guys, if I have the largest audience, like, it makes sense to have the cover story, because then that's the top of the funnel. And Trex, what you say? You said, like, hey, I think this is really good information. And then someone else inside the Mass committee said, but what's your follower count like? And you're like, A, what does that matter? And B, what platform are you talking about? And then someone else said Threads. I don't know who said that, but they said, what's your Threads count, right?
Yeah, so that's usually the debate comes down to Helms talking about his followers on Threads and me talking about my LinkedIn connections.
Oh,
and we go head to head and we try to create a convoluted comparison of, how many LinkedIn connections is worth how many Threads followers and conversion rates. And it's interesting when you're doing all the mathematics and the conversion rate is always 0 and you're trying to still make the math work. But
yeah, that makes the denominator tough. And then Mike and Lauren have these inane comments about, don't we think that we should put our best foot forward in terms of the quality of the content of the article? And then Trex and I are like, guys, I don't even know who you are.
They're
what
just
is
kids.
Your
they don't know
count?
how this business works. They're never going to make it in this town.
Nope, never.
Here today, gone later today. No, I'll just say that one conversion I am very confident in is that 1 million TikTok users is equivalent to one real human. Everything that you see, one real functioning human, right? With your independent thoughts. So it's like, it gets complicated, and I can understand that. But man, it feels great to have another true episode. I know we said we're going to do an hour power, so we will just wrap it up. Anyone in the comment section down below, feel free to leave your comments, and just keep in mind, because this was a masterclass by one E. Trexler. And not only is he here to stay, we are on our very real pyramid, okay, that is from now until the end of time. It has been erected. I try to think of another word. I don't know why, Helms, that word just like, it popped up. But he's here, he stays here. It is the Trinity. And that is pretty much everything. So thank you for watching and listening, I should say, to another episode of Agriculture. You can go ahead and leave a rating and review. We read one Trex in the last episode. Go figure, is 5 stars. It just happened to be 5 stars. It's the most recent review. People typically will leave 5 stars. Sometimes 5 stars, however, with inflation, right, is not enough. And you understand, if you listen to episodes, what that means. We're back every single insert date here from now until the end of time. We'll catch you in that next episode.